Welcome back. Let's recap on what we've touched upon over relations between the EU and Russia in the 17 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Well, relations between the two sides have been far from smooth, and in recent years tensions have escalated over Russian foreign policy. Just last year, the EU Trade Commissioner Peter Mandelson said that EU-Russian relations were at its lowest ebb since the end of the Cold War and are marked with mutual mistrust. Energy is constantly at the center of rows between the EU and the Kremlin. Europe is increasingly reliant on Russian gas reserves, and both sides accuse each other of using energy as a political weapon. Then there's the issue of NATO expansion. Russia isn't a NATO member, but is against the inclusion of some ex-Soviet states. In June, Medvedev said that expansion would seriously damage Russia's relations with the West. Then there's also Chechnya. So far, 34 hearings at the European Court of Human Rights has found Russia guilty of torture, disappearances and executions in the country. But Russia is yet to carry out any investigations. Kosovan independence this year caused another sticking point. Russia branded the move as illegal and again warned that it would have grave consequences on EU-Russian relations. Well, still with us, our guests in Bristol, John Longland, in Moscow, Sergei Lavrov, and in London, Alexander Nekrasov. Mr. Longland, we mentioned quite a number of issues there. Let's talk human rights for a second. Some might ask, can the EU be bringing up the issue of human rights violations seriously, given the friendly and hopeful nature of this conference?
Well, it can, but I think the historical record shows that the European Union and the associated European institutions like the Council of Europe, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe and other organizations have a long record of hypocrisy when it comes to human rights in Russia and Eastern Europe. There's been a long history of Western double standards and Western interference in the post-Soviet, post-communist democratic transition in that part of the world, including in Russia. And I think it would be, to put it mildly, very odd for Britain, for example, which is currently, as you know, waging a war in both Iraq and Afghanistan, to raise human rights issues with Russia over Chechnya, when we are, after all, in Britain, allied with the United States in both those conflicts. And there is very strong evidence of war crimes and even stronger evidence of torture committed by us. So I think if Europe were to raise the issue of human rights in Russia, it would be a case of the pot calling the kettle black. Yeah,
there's another issue where the Russians would use the term double standards. That's Kosovo. Mr. Lavrov, with regards to Kosovo, do you foresee any breakthrough regarding the differing interpretations of the status of Kosovo and Russian non-recognition of Kosovo after this conference?
Well, I think that maybe regarding Kosovo, we have already passed the moment of the lowest misunderstanding between both sides. Moscow realizes that what has happened in Kosovo, this is the reality, and we can't change the decision which has already been taken. So definitely Moscow has cooled down its anti-Western rhetoric regarding Kosovo, and if you just watch the recent statements of Russian leaders, they differ greatly from what was just said just after the proclaiming Kosovo's independence. So Russia is not speaking about Kosovo as a precedent, you see. So and it seems also that Russia doesn't want to support separatist tendencies at the post-Soviet space, trying to play Kosovo card and just supporting given independence to breakaway republics in Georgia, Abkhazia and Southern Ossetia.
Alexander Nekrasov, is NATO at the top of the agenda whenever Russia meets with the European Union?
I think NATO is sort of always a question which is mentioned by the Russian side, because to be honest with you, I think that they're quite bewildered by that determination to expand NATO and move it closer and closer to Moscow's doorstep. And I think that, to be quite honest, NATO is not really doing a good job here, because it knows perfectly well that this is an issue which will irritate, annoy Moscow, and it will force Moscow on the defensive, and still it is determined, it continues to push on and on and on. I think there could have been completely different sets of arrangements agreed, and also with the NATO, of course, comes this missile defense system issue, which again, as we have seen recently, has upset Moscow greatly because of the fact that Lithuania suddenly came into the equation, and there is supposedly talks going on, secret discussions between Washington and Lithuania about the possibility of deploying interceptors on its territory. I think all of those things are basically not helping to improve relations, and I think both sides have to really, really think hard of how they can come to a common ground here.
Well, talking about thinking hard and how they can come to some sort of common ground, John Longland, what do you think Medvedev wants? Let's maybe look at three scenarios with regards to NATO. Does he want to deal with NATO as it is? Does he want to develop or create some sort of counterbalance to NATO, or is he looking for the complete replacement of NATO?
Well, my understanding is that the Russian president, the new Russian president, has indeed called for a replacement to NATO. He called last week, I believe, for a pan-European security system. He said that NATO was no longer capable of ensuring security in Europe. I personally think he's right, but I also suspect that he may know in his innermost heart that it's very unlikely that NATO will ever be replaced. And it's also very unlikely that any European states would agree to join a pan-European system, because all the major European states, particularly particularly Germany and Britain, but also now to a large extent France, are completely dominated by American foreign policy. They essentially don't have independent foreign policies, and therefore they would never do anything which would undermine NATO. Indeed, it's often forgotten that the European treaties themselves commit the European Union never to do anything which undermines NATO. So if Dmitry Medvedev wants to create a pan-European structure, you know, he can talk to the Europeans about it if he wants, but they are essentially subjugated to the Americans on this question, and therefore it's a bit of a dead end, unfortunately.
Sergei Lavrov, can we expect a tangible document to come out of this summit?
No, I think that the major outcome of the summit would not be documents as such, but the atmosphere, which is also important, because as I already said, the basic problem in our relations is lack of confidence, mutual trust. So when we realize that both sides don't have hidden agenda, that they are open for open, mature cooperation, then we would be able to move ahead.
Well, talking about that mistrust, Alexander Nekrasov, will we continue to see the EU and Russia both accusing each other of, for example, using energy as a political weapon?
Well, I think that, to be quite honest with you, every country in the world uses its strong point for its advantage. I mean, if you look at the OPEC nations, can you actually deny they're not using oil to gain some sort of an advantage? Of course they do. And look at China. And can you deny that China is not using its industrial might and its huge, cheap labor market to basically dominate, starting to dominate across the world? Look at America. Look how it uses its military and economic strength. Look at Europe, how it uses financial strength to gain advantage. So to say that Russia is unique in the sense that it's using energy as a means of politics is strange. But what is important here is that Russia uses her advantage in energy in a way that is very Soviet, that is very old style, that is not subtle. That is the problem. Because you know, when they were switching off gas to Ukraine and Belarus, they should have realized that this will have repercussions on the whole world, not just on a group of nations. So I think that the Russian government should really adopt a much more subtle, much more flexible policy and do all the sort of threatening behind the scenes rather than going public.
Let's pose that to John Longland in Bristol. Do you agree that it's not so much Russia's substance, but rather its style that's the problem?
Yes, I'm not sure I agree with Mr. Nekrasov in his analysis of the way that Russia is behaving. I mean, the reason why the gas was cut off, that's now, I think, 18 months ago, it's quite an old story, and of course it was only cut off very briefly, was that the Russians felt that the Ukrainians were stealing the gas and not paying their bills. Now, you may say that it was an excessively strong way to make the point, but it did make the point, and as far as I know, the problem has since been resolved. I think that far from using it in a short-term or short-sighted political way, I think Russia, on the contrary, has every interest in profiling herself as a reliable supplier of energy. People aren't going to build pipelines across continents if they think that Russia will switch off the supply at the touch of a button. So Moscow has every interest in cultivating an image of a reliable supplier, and I'm sure that the people who run the gas companies and who run the Russian state understand that. I don't think that they will use it for short-term political leverage at all.
All right, gentlemen, it's been fascinating hearing your thoughts. John Longland, Sergei Strokan and Alexander Nekrasov, thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer, for joining us here on Inside Story. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.